ahead and get started. So as you all know, this is Austin Schuver's thesis defense, and as Austin's advisor, I have the privilege of introducing him today. Austin grew up in Western Washington, and his parents have joined us today. Thanks so much for coming. He completed his undergraduate degree in human ecology at College of the Atlantic, where he did his senior thesis on conflict over public lands management in the Western U.S., traveling around the Western U.S. to do field work for that project for 2 months. And then after graduating from College of the Atlantic, he worked as a community engagement coordinator for the Frenchman Bay Conservatory, as well as a natural resource social science apprentice for the Sierra Institute. Austin, as many of you know, is also an accomplished photographer and videographer. And while he's been at UN, he did an internship with Conservation Media. He's also been very active in the Society and Conservation Graduate Student Association, really helping to revitalize the SoCon GSA and build community amongst graduate students during the challenging time of the pandemic. Austin, and perhaps most pertinent to this presentation, Austin is currently a student in the graduate program in resource conservation, the MS, as well as the Bridges Food Energy Water program. And he is a member of the Montana Drought and Climate Project team, which is a bigger umbrella project that his research is part of, and also in collaboration with the Montana Climate Office. For those of you who know Austin, you know that he brings incredible passion and commitment and insight into all of these endeavors. And so we've been really fortunate to have him as part of this project. And I'm really excited for him to have a chance to share his findings with all of you today. Before I turn it over to Austin, I'm just going to remind everybody how this works. Basically, Austin's going to present, and then you'll have time to ask questions. We'll have a little bit of time for discussion. And then at 1:30, we will excuse everyone except Austin's committee from the room. And so just be sure that you quickly say your congratulations and then exit. And that's the super fun part where we ask Austin all kinds of really hard questions. Just kidding. We ask Austin all kinds of really fun questions. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Zoom audience, for joining us remotely. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Austin.
Thanks, Lori. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hi, everyone on Zoom. We've got 29 people on Zoom, which is so cool. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about agricultural adaptation to climate change, how Montana farmers respond proactively to unpredictable conditions. For my master's thesis in resource conservation, I set out to better understand how farmers are adapting to climate change and events like drought by conducting interviews across the state. So this is part of a larger project, like Lori mentioned, funded by the USDA to better understand farmers and ranchers' adaptations to conditions like drought and their use of climate information. And that project included a mailed survey and other pieces, but today we're going to focus solely on my interviews with farmers. Here we go. So before I begin, I need to thank so many people who helped with the project, everyone from friends and colleagues in the College of Forestry and Conservation, its best department, the Department of Society and Conservation, of course, and the entire Montana Drought and Climate Project team, including Ada and Kyle, who might be watching remotely right now. I also should acknowledge funding for this project came from USDA, from the Bridges Food Energy Water program, and the National Science Foundation. And I need to thank the people on the ground, the public servants at NRCS who helped me connect with farmers, and for their pictures, which are all from the public domain today. And they're throughout the presentation, and the farmers themselves. These people graciously volunteered their time to participate. Many of them talked to me on the phone for hours from the cab of their tractor as they were, driving through their fields or after a long day's work. So thanks to them. I also need to thank my advisor, Dr. Lori Young, even though she rejected many of my brilliant ideas for titles for this presentation and thesis. But overall put in a lot of time, guidance, and wisdom into me and into this project, and I wouldn't be where I was today without her. I'll especially remember some of her most famous words to live by, which were very important for me, such as killing my children, which is an academic project joke. You have to give up some of your best academic ideas so you can focus on the ones that are really important. So I'll remember that forever, Lori. Thank you. So this presentation roughly follows the structure of my thesis. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement and then get into an introduction and a literature review, followed by research questions, the methods that I use to attempt to answer those research questions, and then the results, the findings from the interviews, and the potential implications of those findings. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we stand on here today at the University of Montana was taken from the Salish and Kalispel people and is part of their homelands for which they have cared for and lived in since time immemorial and are continuing to care for and live in today. Part of this land acknowledgement, which is important to me, is setting the historical context for this research and the land and the industry that this research is based upon. The context is that white settler colonial agriculture in Montana is part of the vast, violent, and deliberate genocide of indigenous people across the country. While this history is overall underrepresented, I need to mention one forgotten piece, which is relevant to agriculture today, and that is to facilitate this displacement of indigenous people. The first white settlers of the plains slaughtered buffalo en masse. You're probably familiar with these types of images. But what I recently learned is that those like millions and millions of buffalo bones were shipped by rail to cities like St. Louis, where they were burned and ground into fertilizer and shipped back to the plains to be spread across the fields for agriculture. So I want to transition from this acknowledgement to the research with a short story. The story begins when I was about 14 years old, and we took a class trip to Northern Arizona. On that class trip, we actually visited the Hopi Reservation, and there a Hopi elder graciously invited us to help seed corn that spring. First, we dug deep holes into the sandy soil until we reached this layer that was hard and moist from water. And in those deep holes, we placed the seeds of their traditional blue corn, poured in some water, and then we covered up the seeds with soil. At the time, of course, the significance of being able to participate in this practice may have not sunk in, this complex religious and cultural history of that place. And it probably didn't sink in until I was in the middle of this research, because this practice is part of thousands of years of adapting a dry farming system to a very unique climatic context. But even farming practices like these, practices that have been so well adapted to climate, that have sustained the Hopi people for thousands of years, even these practices are under threat from climate change. So how can farming Montana, which has only had 100 years of history to adapt to this place, even stand a chance against a changing climate? So it's apparent in this research that to maintain our human capacity to grow food, especially in these dry farming systems like the Hopi systems and much of the crop farming in Montana, which are completely reliant on snowmelt and rainfall, that we need to adapt to climate of the future, not just the climate of the past. And that climate is changing before our very eyes. And that's the focus of my thesis presentation today. So before I dive into the research, I'm going to start with some background material. First, how climate change is impacting Montana agriculture, then a little background on the concept of adaptation, then a climate understanding of how farmers make decisions, and finally, we'll look at climate information and why it might have potential to help farmers adapt. So first, climate change is bringing higher temperatures and longer growing seasons to Montana, and that includes more extreme heat and rain events. And like the disappearing glaciers at Glacier National Park, we will see less snowpack and snowpack that will melt earlier in the season, causing more frequent late summer water shortages, which are especially important for irrigation. The takeaway from this is that climate change will bring new conditions outside the range of climate and variability that farmers or their fathers or their grandfathers have experienced while they've been farming in Montana. To illustrate this, I made this graph of 12 years of precipitation totals from Havre, Montana, a region where the majority of my farmers lived. You can see first on the top in orange here is annual precipitation totals, which is annual precipitation is probably the leading driver of drought in Montana. Some years it's high, almost near 20 inches. And other years, like more recently, it's lower, near 8 inches. And you can just see the huge difference from one year to the next, that those drop-offs and variabilities is a type of variability called interannual variability, which is expected to worsen with climate change. The other thing to note here is that in this region, the blue bars below, which are monthly precipitation totals, most of that precipitation is actually coming smack in the middle of each year, in between each of those vertical lines. And so that means that farmers are getting most of their precipitation during June, July, and August, right during the summer growing season. And that carries implications such as not knowing while you're planning what to plant, whether you're going to get those big spikes that lead to a 20-inch precipitation year or not. And just before I leave this slide, you can just see the first 5 months of 2022 there. It's not looking very good. So we know that climate change will have many impacts on agriculture in Montana, but the short is that in 30 years, one industry report predicted a 25% loss in grain yields and losses of over 10,000 jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. So finding ways to adapt to climate change is clearly important. But what is adaptation exactly? One technical definition is that it's a deliberate change in response to a stressor, like climate change might be. And though we know it's not in response to a single factor, like solely climate, you can't adapt to solely climate alone, because someone who is adapting to climate has to consider markets and technologies and local knowledge and other systems. And each of these scales is nested within each other and interconnected to other systems like economics, politics, culture, and social norms. So there are a lot of ways to think about adaptation, but one way to break it down would be by geographic scope. So on one end, individuals like farmers can adapt, and that's sometimes called autonomous adaptation. And then on the other end, you could have more global or national adaptation that's driven by policy or treaty making. Another scale is extent. And so on one end is incremental adaptation, a series of small changes to an existing system. And on the other end of that scale is transformative adaptation, where major changes to the system may make it completely unrecognizable, change to a completely new state. The final way to understand adaptation is whether it occurs before or after an event, whether it's proactive or reactive adaptation. And that scale is important because climate scientists everywhere are saying that the vast majority of adaptation so far is reactive. That is, it's happening after that severe flood, or it's happening after the drought, not before it. So it makes sense that if you adapt beforehand, it's better than adapting after the fact. We know that proactive adaptation in agriculture specifically can reduce financial and crop losses to farmers who are experiencing those sorts of events. So how can Montana farmers pursue adaptations? They might include things like earlier planting or finding different or more drought tolerant crops, minimizing their tillage to retain more moisture in the soil, or cover cropping, diversifying their sources of income, or using climate information to reduce their risk, or using improved technologies or practices to increase their efficiency, to save moisture, to save money, to overcome bad years. But for some researchers, farmers' perceptions of climate change, which are often, let's say, not super responsive to the idea of human-caused climate change, those negative perceptions could pose a problem for their willingness to adapt to climate change. And so, for instance, most farmers don't think about climate change related adaptation when they make decisions. And they describe climate change as the least of their worries, stating that only multiple years of climate related losses would cause them to actually adapt to climate change. Yet at the same time, research shows that many farmers are observing a changing climate, and even farmers who don't believe in climate change are doing things that can make their operations better adapted to climate change. This tension, one researcher called skeptical but adapting, is why so many more farmers are adapting reactively rather than proactively. They're adapting to the climate they've already experienced, and not to the worsening effects that are right around the corner. And their adaptation is based on an experiential knowledge that is the climate that they've experienced over time, rather than those predictions of the climate that's coming in the future. So for climate scientists and others, the question becomes, can we give farmers more and better information about future weather and climate conditions so they will use them to adapt more proactively to those climate changes that are coming? And for example, information like these 3-month forecasts shown here show the chances compared to a normal year, like a normal summer, whether there will be more or less rainfall over the growing season. So that's the top chart there is for precipitation, and then the bottom one is for temperature. Crucially, this kind of information could allow farmers to adapt more proactively ahead of those impacts. And some models do show that there are good signs for this, right? That these kinds of information, especially the 3-month forecasts, could help farmers prepare for conditions, but they're still not widely used. So that brings us to my research today. We know that climate change will have a dramatic impact on Montana farmers and that adaptation is needed, probably more proactive long-term adaptation before it's too late. And we hope that climate information, like those 3-month forecasts that I showed, could help farmers make decisions that will help them adapt. So the questions I asked first were, what adaptations are farmers in Montana pursuing proactively and reactively, and what do they need to do so? In other words, what are farmers in Montana doing to make themselves better adapted to climate change, and what does that adaptation look like? Second, what are the important factors influencing those decisions, or what is influencing farmers' agency to adapt? And finally, how does climate information play into that process, if at all? Do those types of predictive climate information like the 3-month forecasts help farmers prepare in advance? So to answer these questions, here are my methods. First, we have to ask, why is Montana a good place to even do this research to begin with? For one, agriculture is one of the leading industries in the state. Montana is among the nation's leaders in many crops like wheat, barley, lentils, and oilseeds. And Montana's top crop, wheat, which makes up over 25% of the entire state's agricultural production by value, is usually grown dry land without any irrigation. So dryland wheat has been called an early warning sign for climate change because the crop itself cannot tolerate much more stress, which underscores that crop farming in Montana itself is threatened. And it's already on the margins of producing marketable crops with the very limited rain, and that farmers in Montana are much more isolated from ports and markets than farmers in other parts of the country. Therefore, the industry as a whole in the state cannot tolerate much more stress, which is why adaptation is so important here. Another reason to study in Montana is because of drought. Longer and more severe drought is a major way that climate change will impact the state, and the state's agriculture has already experienced periods of widespread extreme drought. So on this chart, you can see how variable drought is year to year. From the beginning of the century, there's a lot of prolonged drought, and then it has eased back. And then you can see during my research period last summer that a severe extreme drought has set in again, and we'll see how prolonged this drought becomes. During that time, when I was doing research, it was actually around 70% of the state was in moderate drought conditions, and the governor declared a statewide drought emergency. So who did I talk with to try to answer these questions? I interviewed 31 farmers across 18 counties. Most interviews occurred over the phone because of scheduling and COVID challenges. And most occurred with farmers who lived in the Golden Triangle region, which is in north central Montana. It's an area characterized by dry land, no-till farming, but like most of the state, it's also highly industrial, and it grows cash crops for a global export market. These farmers are relying on inputs like fertilizers and herbicides, yet nearly all of these farms are still family owned. So to conduct interviews, I used an interview guide with probes that helped me compare between interviews and also allowed farmers to discuss the topics that were most relevant to them in greater detail. And this guide included giving farmers 4 examples of climate information with short interpretive text, which isn't shown here. But for this research today, I focused on 2 forms of that information, which were aimed at predicting climate and weather. The 3-month forecasts, which you saw earlier, but are shown again here, and mid-century projections, which are presented here as spatial climate analogs. So we gave these analogs to farmers, which show the temperature and precipitation projections for the year 2050 in 3 example Montana towns. In this example, the future 2050 climate of Fort Benton, which is in north central Utah or north central Montana there, is being compared with the current climate of Salem, Utah, in northern Utah. So in 30 years, Fort Benton will look like what Salem looks like today. Okay, now to the results. I've tried to maintain as much of farmers' voices in here as possible, so you'll hear me like read a lot of quotes from farmers, which I think is really cool. I hope it doesn't get old. And the findings that emerged from these interviews I've organized as follows. First, how did farmers perceive weather and climate? Then, how did they perceive climate information that was supposed to help them predict that weather and climate? Followed by farmers' short-term and then their long-term adaptations. So there will be 4 parts in this results. First, I found that unpredictability and variability in weather and climate made planning very difficult for farmers. As this farmer said, drought, you don't have any idea when it's coming, how long it's going to be here, or how bad it's going to be when it comes. When talking to farmers, the inherent unpredictable nature of short-term weather events like rainfall or drought, it just made it clear that planning for these events was incredibly difficult, and that did not bode well for their proactive decision-making. Or as another farmer said, we're always in a drought and sometimes it rains. Unpredictability, it was paired with this sort of inevitability, right? It's like farmers could not plan for specific conditions ahead of time because for many of them to do so would be like a fool's errand. I had farmers telling me that it would be like admitting defeat to plan for a drought to come, right? They would say you don't plan your farm for a bad year because if the rain does come, then you lose out on so much potential productivity. The short-term unpredictability also extended into longer timescales, so into the variability of climate season to season, so year to year variability, kind of like what I mentioned earlier with the precipitation chart. As this dryland farmer said, you don't have a clue what's coming. I mean, it's either feast or famine. There are very few years that are in between. Many farmers like this one talked about their experiences with erratic and unpredictable, variable season to season weather and climate, and that made it hard for them to plan. And it points back to that, that interannual variability that is worsening with climate change. So that sets up the second main finding of the interviews, which is that for most farmers, climate information, those 3-month and mid-century projections that I showed earlier, they were too unreliable to influence how farmers made proactive decisions that we think will be necessary for climate change. So during the interviews, you would think that that sort of unpredictability would make farmers try to welcome the 3-month forecast because they needed an answer to that unpredictability. But climate information did not allow farmers to overcome the unpredictability that they saw. One reason is that their perceptions of climate information were influenced by their perceptions of the 7-day and the 10-day weather forecasts that they saw. So as this Prairie County farmer said, in eastern Montana, we're flying blind as weather goes. When I showed the earlier chart on precipitation, I noted it tends to occur during the summer, during June, July, and August, right during that primary summer growing season. That fact combined with the unreliability that farmers saw in short-term weather forecasting, whether they got it on cable news or the weather app, the 7 to 10 day forecasts, that unreliability opened up this sort of unknown in weather for which many farmers filled that void with an optimism, a weather optimism. And so they thought that their fate and the fate of their crops could turn around at any moment during the growing season. And one way that they said this was, like this farmer said, one storm system that they were wrong about, and we're going to have a nice crop. This one storm, oh, sorry, wrong direction. This one storm belief that an inaccurate forecast could still hold the rainfall that they needed, it was really common among dryland farmers. As this farmer in Liberty County put it, it doesn't take much rain. The 1/10 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch at the right time can take you from 10 bushel to 20 bushel. Because that they thought that the weather forecasts were too unreliable to predict any one storm that might be necessary to yield a good crop, many farmers thought that planning in anticipation of specific weather conditions, whether drought or rain, was pointless or even counterproductive. Now, farmers' perceptions of a lack of reliability also deepened in longer timescales. And so the 7-day forecasts I just mentioned, that same perception carried into 3-month forecasts. The vast majority of farmers believe that these 3-month forecasts were not useful for planning. They said things like, I don't really believe any of it more than a couple of days out. The farther you get out, the less reliable. They've all been wrong. They're pretty much bullshit. Is this like flipping the coin and going to Vegas? Those bozos don't have any idea what's going to happen 15 days from now. How in the hell are they going to project out 90 days? Complete hit or miss. I have so little faith in any of it. I don't even look at anything over a month. It's useless to me, and longer than 10 days usually lies to me. Therefore, it's clear most farmers did not find 3-month forecasts to be useful or influential in helping them adapt proactively. Now, moving to the even longer time scale, most farmers were unfamiliar with the sort of mid-century projections and were hesitant to think about them because of the inherent uncertainty of looking 30 years into the future. As this farmer said, I respect the fact that their mid-century projection is based on scientific data and mine is on my gut, but I guess I have a hard time buying into guaranteeing that we're going to have significant change in the next 30 years. It will change, I don't doubt that, but how, which way, and what, I think is pretty bold to say. So therefore, the perceptions of unreliability of any future projecting or predicting information, the same unreliabilities farmers saw in the 7-day and the same that they saw in the 3-month, carried into and worsened with the extended timescales of the mid-century projections. On the left-hand side here, you can see the quote from the farmer from Liberty County who said, I believe mid-century projections more if they could get 3 months from now accurate, let alone 2050. These timescales sort of build on each other, right? They're connected over time in farmers' perceptions. And so many farmers felt that any longer timescales beyond multiple days, whether they believed in climate change or not, simply could not be predicted with accuracy. And on the right-hand side here, other farmers stated concern based on a lack of relevance to their day-to-day operation. So one farmer said, a 30-year projection I don't think affects many of us. And another said, how's that going to change what I do right now? So they also struggle to translate the content of a 30-year projection into specific day-to-day decisions in their operation. And only a few farmers discuss potential changes like growing new crop varieties or investing in new water systems because of those mid-century projections. So it was there a little bit, but the overwhelming sentiment from farmers was that it was hard to translate to those decisions that they were making. Okay, now to the third finding. How could farmers make decisions? How were they making decisions in response to climate and weather? So for the short-term responses, which we're going to start out with, those decisions that farmers make in advance of basically every growing season, ideally using the information like the 3-month forecasts that I showed. Though the prevailing theme was that farmers, their growing season decisions in response to climate and weather specifically were either impossible, they had this lack of agency for those decisions, or that trying to be proactive in that way was a complete gamble. So as this farmer stated, there's no drastic changes I can make that I see. Or this farmer, when they looked at a dry 3-month forecast, there's not a whole heck of a lot I can do about it. most farmers mentioned some kind of lack of agency to make the proactive decisions that might be enabled by a 3-month forecast. Yet at the same time, there's a little bit of flexibility in farmers' crop rotations, right? So this farmer said, we don't do much different for the weather. If it's too dry to seed winter wheat, you just don't seed winter wheat, you just seed it in the spring. Well, if it gets to the spring and it's still too dry, you seed it anyway, because it's all you can do, and then just hope it rains. So as this farmer stated, there's some flexibility within the rotation, but at the end of the day, most farmers still have to rely on that kind of blind weather optimism that I mentioned earlier, that the rain that they need will come during the growing season. This context led farmers to perceive proactive decisions over the short term as gambles. So they said things like, you've got to have a lot of luck, it's good luck, dumb luck, whatever. It's a bet, it's a coin toss, I took a gamble, you're professionally a gambler, or anybody in agriculture is a gambler because of these short-term proactive decisions that they're trying to make over the growing season. Farmers felt that ability, if they tried to do something, it simply came down to luck. So that raises the question. It's clear that most farmers were not using climate information to adapt at those timescales, and they struggled to find agency in the short-term responses to weather, but were they adapting at longer timescales? And it turns out, yes, actually they are. Instead of rolling the dice, many farmers describe turning to longer-term adaptations that minimize the importance of short-term gambles altogether. So what does this look like? As one farmer put it plainly, we spend a year conserving and developing a moisture profile on our fallow ground, and that dictates what we're going to do rather than the 3-month forecast. This farmer is essentially saying that their no-till and fallow practices determine how much of that rainfall, that precious rainfall that they maintain in the soil, is actually going to last until the growing season. And if a farmer can probe the soil and know how much moisture is there, and if it's enough for a crop to mature, they can go ahead and grow. And so it doesn't matter in some cases if they have no moisture, even they're locked in this cycle where they have already delayed. Sometimes they have to sow the crop and just hope that it rains. So by using a sort of more longer term strategy, which actually focuses on the ability to trap that moisture whenever it does come, the farmer is sort of using the soil like a bank, right? They can regain some of their agency in the decisions because they know how much they have in the bank. To give you a little better understanding of what the farmer was talking about in terms of like the long-term approach to retain moisture, I made this cartoon diagram, which I'm very proud of. No-till farming is on the left and tillage farming is on the right. And so no-till farming is this practice that's become incredibly common in the Golden Triangle, especially that north central region of Montana. That's a lot of dryland wheat farmers. It involves minimizing any disturbance at all to the soil, especially before and during seeding. And that has many benefits, but the biggest benefit for farmers in a sort of climate conscious way is retaining more moisture in the soil, because when you till the soil, you're losing moisture. And the other benefit of no-till is often involves some kind of crop residue or ground cover. The previous season's crop is actually the sort of leftover bits are left on top of the soil. And that also insulates the soil and protects moisture that's going to infiltrate. Yet one of the problems with no-till is that it can often seem like such a long-term adaptation for farmers. It can take years for them to continually upgrade and improve their equipment and their practices, so that naturally it also takes time for that moisture to build up in the soil and the nutrients to build up and the other benefits of no-till to pay off. So in that way, it's kind of an incremental adaptation, like I mentioned earlier. It takes many steps over the long term. And here's how another farmer described the way that they use this sort of no-till long-term approach to adapt their operation to climate and to unpredictability specifically. They said, long-term wise, we're trying to get the organic matter up so it holds more water. So when I do get a 3-inch rain or a 4-inch rain or a time period when it does rain, we're holding more of that water in the top 6, 8, 10 inches than I ever had before. And so that sometimes is holding on to the next rain event, which might be 2 days away, 2 weeks away, 2 months away. I don't know. And to me, so like a finding like this is actually super exciting and hopeful, right? Because for one, you don't know this just by looking at this quote, but this farmer really didn't care about climate change, right? And we know that's not uncommon amongst farmers and amongst people in Montana generally. And not only that, but this is not some like hippie, like regenerative agriculture farmer, right? This is like a totally conventional farmer, someone who talked about using as much Roundup as they could to like maximize their yield. So I think this is just really a really important finding, right? So it's even more important when you think about how hard it is to think about a long-term strategy like this when you're in a short-term economic model, right? So every farmer I spoke to talked constantly about the short-term pressures, like making ends meet every year, when it felt like everything, like markets, economics, the price of fertilizer, the price that they get for the crop that they grow, everything was constantly changing outside their control, right? So any year could be the year where they go out of business. And despite that, there were still all kinds of farmers who were talking about taking a long-term approach, a long-term perspective that was allowing them to be better adapted to climate. So the seeds of a long-term proactive climate adaptation are already being sown here. And not only that, but these seeds are actually bearing fruit. And when I mean fruit, like for farmers, it's like often money. So farmers found that this adaptation wasn't taking years and years and years to pay off for them, right? It's part of the reason why these no-till adaptations, I think, have been adopted quickly in certain parts of Montana, because money-wise, they were paying off. And that's part of the reason why these practices are becoming so widespread compared to other practices, maybe like cover cropping, which can take multiple years for a farmer to see the benefits, see the dividends of that practice pay off. And so, for example, this farmer described the immediate benefits that they were getting from no-till when they started adopting it. They said, my father was probably one of the first people in the area to go to a no-till style of farming. He said, we actually got audited, I think it was 4 years in a row, because the government couldn't believe his yields were climbing so fast. So to summarize the results, first, we saw that farmers thought that weather was unpredictable and the climate was incredibly variable, which made it hard for them to plan both for certain conditions in the upcoming growing season, but also to know what any given year will look like, because the years look so different from one another. Second, farmers said that climate information, the 3-month forecasts and mid-century projections, were simply not reliable enough to help them make proactive decisions. They didn't see that reliability. Further, farmers felt like the few short-term responses that they had for weather over the growing season were gambles, or that those kind of responses in advance of drought or rain were simply impossible. But finally, and I think most optimistically, farmers were adapting. They were using incremental long-term approaches, which effectively buffered against short-term fluctuations in weather and in markets, but they were doing so with those adaptations that also provided them with immediate benefits. And often those had to be financial benefits. The moisture took time to accrue in the soil, and the other benefits built up. They also got the immediate benefits of seeing some increases in yields. And so we saw less of those adaptations, which did not have those sort of short-term advantages. Okay, so this brings us to the implication. How can this research help us understand farmers' proactive adaptations and help farmers better adapt for the climate change in the future? First, compared to the literature on the topic, we confirmed that farmers in Montana are adapting to a range of factors, not just climate, in their decision-making. And like a few other studies in Australia and elsewhere have shown, this kind of farm-scale, autonomous, individual adaptation is used to buffer against those short-term fluctuations in weather. And we can expand that to note that it's providing short-term benefits in some cases, like those immediate profits. And like other studies have shown, farmers do not seem to be using climate information very widely in their decisions. And if they are, it doesn't seem to be a major factor in that decision-making process, right? Because they're adapting to so many different things at once in a complex decision-making process. But I think there may be potential for better integrating those 3-month and mid-century projections into farmers' decisions simply by looking at the types of decisions that they're already making and better tailoring that information so it helps with those decisions. So for example, mid-century projections could be paired with information about those incremental long-term adaptations that are buffering against a range of conditions. Adaptations like no-till, which are adapting to climate change, but also buffering against variability in general and providing immediate benefits for farmers. That could help these practices, one, become more widespread, and two, help farmers who are already doing them to keep improving and continuing on those practices. And then so another way to use mid-century projections would be to give more information about those new crop varieties. Like some farmers mentioned, oh yeah, I can think about growing different varieties of crops because the climate is changing. So those types of decision relevant information could be paired with climate information to make it more central to the way farmers make decisions. But some researchers fear that this type of autonomous individual adaptation won't be enough for adapting to climate change. So we might need a more transformative type of adaptation, which might hinge on higher scale policy changes that could be crucially important for helping farmers adapt practices. And I'll mention 2 types of policy mechanisms here that could help in opening up more options for farmers to adapt. The first is crop insurance, which is generally focused on the short term. It helps farmers overcome single bad seasons. And it could be adjusted to include more of those long-term approaches that farmers are thinking about, right? So taking a short-term mechanism and trying to integrate some of the long-term thinking that farmers are already doing. So for instance, some farmers mentioned that certain rules in crop insurance make it difficult to do cover crops or to interseed crops. And so just opening up the potential for farmers to even experiment with those practices could have huge dividends for climate adaptation in Montana. The second policy would be cost shares. So like EQIP or something like these government programs help farmers reduce the burden of trying new practices or investing in new equipments. But a lot of farmers spoke about how that they're afraid to enroll in a program like that because it will lock them into that practice. And they don't have that short-term flexibility that they might need to adjust to weather or climate. So this is taking a sort of like long-term program that is almost often like a loan program, right, over multiple years, and trying to tweak it so it's more aware of the short-term pressures that farmers are experiencing. So on one hand, the short-term crop insurance could be more long-term, and the long-term cost share could be more short-term. The last thing that I'll mention here is that climate information, which farmers don't seem to be using widely right now, could be used by policymakers. Like this type of scientific information could inform these types of changes to policy to help rule makers understand that these types of adaptations are crucially important. And so climate information could contribute to more transformative policy changes that could open up a suite of adaptation options for farmers who are the experts in finding the practices and options that will give them the best chance to adapt and stay viable over the long term. And so finding ways like these to incentivize farmers to continue adopting the strategies that they're already building into their practices and proactively build that buffer to long-term climate change. Because in the end of the day, like climate adaptation will look different for every farmer, right? Every farmer is going to have a different type of adaptation that works for them. And so the idea here is to really open up the suite of options that would be available for them to experiment and try and see what works best for them. So that's my presentation today. Thank you for sticking with us. Thanks everyone online. Take some questions now. That's such a good question. I didn't ask people how old they were in my interviews. We had that data, the survey data more clearly where we asked them what their age was. So I'm just going off of my sense of how old they were. And the one area in particular that was pretty interesting that I seemed to like hear different things from farmers was especially in those like mid-century 2050 projections, right? And so older farmers were expressing things like, I'm going to be done farming soon. So like, why do I need what, like, why is this relevant to me at all? Like, why is 2050 doesn't matter to me, sort of thing. Whereas the younger farmers, I thought were a little more willing to think about the things that they could be doing to their operation over time. And throughout that, though, like a lot of people were just like either, and I think especially older farmers were either like really sad about like some of this. They were like, wow, like farming's gonna have to be really different in the future. While a lot of younger people were like, yeah, farmers are really resilient and like we've been adapting and we can adapt and like we can handle this. And so that's kind of an interesting, age difference there. Yeah. Hi, Audrey.
I'm curious. I want to hear about how you, I guess, built trust and rapport with the farmers that you interviewed when you mentioned that so many of them just do not like recognize that climate change is a concept or a thing. And so when you approach them for interviews and said, I'm interviewing farmers about responses to climate change, what kind of initial responses did you get, and did they change over the course of your interviews as you kind of had conversations that would last hours long?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hopefully the folks on Zoom can hear me now. I don't think they heard the last one, but sorry about that. So I didn't come out and say I'm going to talk to you about climate change, first of all, and I didn't actually have any questions about climate change specifically in my interview, right? The thing that most like elicited ideas of climate change were, one, that I'm like a student from Missoula, and they were like, I know what you're doing here, right? Like they knew. And so one farmer I emailed was like, I just said, like, I'd like to talk to you about your experience with drought and weather and climate and what you think, right? That's the sort of like general boilerplate thing. And he emailed back and he's like, oh, you want to talk to me about climate change? Like, so they like no, but it, like at the end of the day, we're talking about like how your operation can withstand the conditions that people are experiencing day to day, right? And how those things can be improved going forward. And so a lot of them mentioned climate change, especially when we got to the end, which is when the 2050 projections were presented, and they had an opportunity to tell me what they thought. And that came out multiple times, but I think in general, it wasn't like what farmers thought about climate change. It wasn't like a huge focus, but it's interesting that, sort of some of the findings like that's really not a factor, right? Because it came out and you could tell who was talking about climate change, either denying it or believing in it. And that influenced the way they looked at mid-century, but it also didn't influence the way that they were taking on these long-term approaches to build soil moisture and do these things that will help them adapt to climate change. So yeah, Megan. Yeah. It did. And that's one of the questions, one of the probes that I would ask is like, where do you get this, or where is it useful? So going into the climate information portion of the interview, I did not like go out and say like, we made this at the University of Montana from the climate office, right? So I kept that until the end, and I told them if they wanted to know. And some people were like, oh, cool, like that's where I know where to get this information. And I think it was only one person who was like, oh, the University of Montana, like I know those people at the University of Montana, like that's a super like liberal, like that's not where I want to get this information. Like, why aren't you partnering with Montana State? And we have done some work with Montana State, but I mean that matters to some people, and I found, though, in general it doesn't seem to matter to a lot of people, right? They either believe in that kind of science and that kind of research, or they don't. It doesn't really matter where it's coming from, because they can sort of interpolate like, oh, if I'm getting information about climate change, then it's probably not information that I want to believe in, right? So like somebody just like straight off laughed when I showed them the mid-century projections. They're like, like they thought it was just hilarious that I was asking questions about that because they didn't subscribe to climate change, right? But it doesn't change the fact that we had a really good conversation about the ways that their operation was going to overcome all the fluctuations and things that they're seeing. So I don't know. Does that help answer? Yeah. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions on it, but go ahead.
Well, my kind of
Yeah, well, especially with the 3-month forecasts, like most farmers you saw like thought they were bogus, but basically every farmer had seen them. They find them in the agricultural magazines. A lot of them go and look at that information. They're like, I check it out because I think it's super interesting, but I don't really believe in it. And so like there's this opportunity maybe if it becomes more accurate to win some of that trust, because they clearly like to pay attention to this kind of thing, but and a lot of them spoke to this is like, I just saw too many errors in it, so I don't think it's reliable. So there is potential for that. A lot of them didn't see the longer mid-century projections, like they were unfamiliar with that kind of information. And so that would be something that would be, maybe needs to be disseminated more widely, but the 3-month forecast for sure. And the like soil moisture, snowpack stuff, they're like all familiar with that. So yeah. Neva.
What do we know about the reliability of those 3-month forecasts? Because you have to be able to go back and look at that historically.
Kelsey?
This is a really cool conversation, and Lori kind of came over and whispered as you were presenting that slide about the contrast between the 3-month and the 50, mid-century projections. And if they can't get the 3-month right, why would we ever trust the mid-century? And it comes down to conversation around questions of scale and model accuracy at different time scales.
Right.
The director of the Climate Prediction Center has, in a conversation, literally said, we know the 2- and 3-month forecasts aren't very useful and that they're highly, highly uncertain. Those are the hardest predictions to make, even relative to a 50-year forecast, 50 years out,
Right.
At large scales and long time scales. And so it's really cool to see that farmers don't trust them either. And it begs the question, why are we putting that information out there?
Right.
The 1-month forecasts, they're often right, or a good best guess in terms of putting that on, but the 2- and 3-month forecasts aren't great.
What is the percent accuracy?
That's a great question. I don't know that anybody's actually gone back and assessed the accuracy.
You'd think you'd want to know whether you got it right.
Yeah, it
seems like a lot.
it comes down to that 3-month time scale. So when those forecasts are produced, they're based upon current and antecedent conditions. So if the low pressure system is coming from the Pacific coast and the jet streams at a current state, they're able to use that information to project forward in a month or 2 months, right? But in 2 months, it's much harder to know what those conditions are. So the uncertainty gets really high at longer scales.
And then, there's so much variability out there in the world too. But, it can rain in your neighbor's place, but not on yours. I mean, in Montana.
Yeah, and those bars that you're showing for the summer rainfall, those are very isolated and localized events. So River versus Malta versus Sydney, they all have highly variable precipitation patterns. In terms of those convective summer thunderstorms.
Right. And that feeds into that one storm. Like if we get the storm, maybe somebody else won't get that one storm that we need, right? Wherever it goes. Yeah, that's interesting. There's a question here that's, did farmers plant as much acreage as possible every year? It depended on their system. There was a lot of diversified, there's a good portion of diversified farmers who tried to have a good rotation with fallow and with pulse crops that would regenerate nitrogen in the soil. And so it really depended. There's people on both ends of that sort of diversified versus monoculture spectrum of growing. Good question from Selena about what does this mean for returning to a more natural prairie-like system that naturally increases biodiversity and increases organic matter in the soil and soil nutrients. And I think that's a really good question because one of the, if you talk about transformative adaptation, like that would be a transformation of the agricultural system to move to whether it's a more rangeland system that has diverse wild prairies in it, because whether that's because rainfall changes so much that farmers can't maintain their operations as reliable. So maybe you change to a completely different system that looks like more natural prairie, like used to be here, that can withstand some operations over a larger scale. I mean, the opposite end of that is how do farmers diversify their operations even more, growing as many crops as they can, right? Like some farmers were trying to grow 20 different crops in their fields on a 20 crop rotation. And so that kind of diversification sort of mirrors like biodiversity in a way and helps farmers overcome not only economic, but like weather fluctuations. And so both of those might be an answer to that. Yeah, Gabe.
Actually, along those same lines, I was going to ask how it was for you in semi-structured interviews to, did you feel like you had an opportunity to broach other environmental kinds of questions beyond climate, like biodiversity, or for instance, this farmer who uses as much Roundup as possible, which we know, can disrupt all kinds of ecological processes, and yet they have, and you showed as an important finding that they can maintain their water and moisture, presumably for a better crop-free economic reasons. Did you feel like in that interview or in others similar that you had the flexibility or ever the desire to pivot from questions of climate into other like environmental and values-based often discussions?
That's a good question. So for the folks online, the question is, how often or did we want to talk about other issues other than climate, other environmental stewardship issues in agriculture? And there are a lot of people who volunteer that kind of thing, right? So there was a question at the beginning, it's like, what are your goals for your operation? And some people straight out say, like, I want to take care of the land, I want to take care of the soil, right? So sometimes the conversations about that comes out that way. Other times I think there's just like, there is a lot of overlap with some of these things. Like farmers are trying to do their best within the constraints of a system that they don't have very much control over. And so they are trying to reduce, like, a lot of them are reducing how much fertilizer and herbicide that they put on their fields, right? And there's a lot of new technology that helps them do that tracks exactly where their tractor was, and like it changes the rate of application depending on where in the field they are, and like all of these kind of metrics that have like increased their efficiency and saved money and like probably saved runoff and like helped with all of these environmental causes, right? And so there's just the problem of like having to break even every year.
Were
So
you tempted as a researcher to like broach those issues, or were you pretty restrained, I guess, within the interview?
I stuck to the interview guide, if that's what you're asking, which did not really stray out that way. Yeah,
Props.
it is, right? Yeah. Yes.
So did you get a sense that the farmers talk to each other, or they compare each other's fields? Like, oh, hey, you planted barley last week, maybe I should get on it, or what the heck is the deal with that barley so early, or do they talk to each other, or do they just watch each other, or is that do they talk about that at all?
Yeah, that is interesting. I did, and I think they do maintain networks, obviously, and talk about those sort of things. Whether that connects to like climate change in that way of like planting earlier or doing these adaptations, it does, but I don't think it's under the topic of climate adaptation, right? They know that they're planting earlier, and that they especially talk to their fathers and their grandfathers and talk about the weather that they had experienced and how it compares to what they're going through now. And like back in my day, we never got that many bushels out of our wheat crop, and we never planted that early. So yeah, they do, and I think they do notice those widespread changes in terms of a lot of farmers talked about the no-till revolution in the Golden Triangle. It was happening in the 80s and the 90s, and seeing the difference it made, because like soil erosion was such a big deal, right? You could see that difference. And so when it comes to like adapting to climate, like the obvious outcome maybe isn't as obvious as like there was no more huge dust storms or something. So that might be limiting that. But at the same time, like farmers know, like I spoke to one person who said like you see so much less barley around here than you used to because the actually like this Belgian company and these other European companies bought up like Miller Coors and like we're getting shit prices for our barley now. And so many people are going away from that. And so, yeah, all of that kind of goes into it. If that helps. Yeah, Lori.
We're unfortunately out of time, so if you're done, we'll call it.